Good evening. Welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's virtual program, American Mirror with Roberto Saba and Manisha Sinha. We're joining you this evening from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community who remain a vibrant presence here in central Massachusetts. I'm Nan Wolverton, Vice President for Programs at the Society, and I'd like to start by briefly introducing the American Antiquarian Society, where much of the research and writing for the book that we'll hear about this evening took place. AAS is a national research library and archive in Worcester, Massachusetts. We collect, preserve, and share materials that were printed or produced before 1900 in what is now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections, housed on some 25 miles of shelving, include newspapers and periodicals, books and pamphlets, graphic arts materials, children's literature, and manuscripts. AAS supports and welcomes scholars and readers from around the country and the world to use our reading room or to seek out materials on our website. We also offer regular programming like this virtual program, and I invite you to return to join us for upcoming programs in the coming weeks and months. You can go to our website for continual updates, including series such as Women Make History, Nature and the Environment, and Perspectives from the Collections. As a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support that you can provide to help keep the work that we do going forward, and thank you for that. I am joined this evening by my colleague, Amanda Condick, who will share with you just a few logistics about the format of the program and about how you can engage with the speakers in the question and answer portion of the program. So, Amanda.
Thank you, Nan. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Closed captioning is available for tonight's program via Zoom's live transcription. You can turn the closed captioning on and off with the button labeled CC, which is located on the bottom of your Zoom screen. Throughout the program, I'll be posting relevant links and information in the chat. If you would like to save the chat to have the links for future use, you can save a transcription by opening the chat window and clicking on the three dots in the bottom right-hand corner. If you have any problems with your visual or audio settings, you can also message me in the chat. For the Q&A portion of our program, we'll be using the Q&A function, which is located on the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you have any questions for our speakers, please type them in there. The Q&A also has an upvote option, so if someone posts something you would like to see discussed, be sure to upvote it by clicking on the thumbs up icon. And you can place your questions into the Q&A at any point during the program. And finally, we are recording this program and we'll make it available on our YouTube channel and our website. So thank you, Nan. Back to you.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. Both of this evening's guests have spent a great deal of time in the reading room at the American Antiquarian Society, and I'm delighted to bring them together here in the virtual realm. They have not met in person, but their work intersects in many ways, so this should be a really exciting evening. Roberto Saba is an assistant professor of American Studies at Wesleyan University. He received his PhD in trans-regional history at the University of Pennsylvania. Saba is the author of The Voices of the Nation, Petitions and Politics in the Beginning of Brazil's Second Reign, published in 2012, and his recent book, American Mirror, The United States and Brazil in the Age of Emancipation, was published by Princeton University in 2021. Roberto held a 12-month Hinch post-dissertation fellowship at the American Antiquarian Society in 2017, which allowed him to work on the American Mirror book. Manisha Sinha is a Draper Chair in American History at the University of Connecticut. She is the author of The Counter-Revolution of Slavery, Politics and Ideology in the Antebellum South Carolina, published by the University of North Carolina Press in 2000, as well as the author of the multiple award-winning The Slave's Cause, A History of Abolition, published by Yale University Press in 2017. Her next book is on the reconstruction of American democracy after the Civil War, and it is due out in spring of 2023. Manisha was a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellow at the AAS in 2004-05, and she was the Mellon Distinguished Scholar in Residence at the Society in 2020. She is also a newly elected counselor of the AAS. So we will start this evening with Roberto giving an overview of his book, and then Manisha will join for conversation with Roberto before we open things up for your questions. So let's turn things over to Roberto to get things underway.
Okay. Thank you, Nan, Amanda, for the invitation, for organizing the event. Thank you, Manisha, so much for engaging with my work. I'm a huge fan of your work, and it's an honor for me to have you discuss my book with me. Thank you for all of you in the audience, and thank you so much to all AAS friends for the amazing work you do for historians and other researchers. So I'll share my screen and I'll get started, try to summarize American Mirror in a few minutes. And then I look forward to your comments, questions, and the conversation with Manisha. So by the 1850s, the United States and Brazil were by far the largest slave societies in the world. The United States held approximately 4 million human beings in chains, while Brazil enslaved 2 million people. It seems natural that these two countries would have cooperated in defending the institution of slavery, but they didn't. In fact, what I show in American Mirror is that Brazilian slaveholders became commercial partners and diplomatic allies of Northern Yankee Republican capitalists, the same people who crushed the slaveholders of the South, of the American South, took a very patient approach to the problem of slavery in Brazil. In the process, these Northerners made great profits and were able to present themselves to the world as benevolent modernizers. Brazilian coffee planters relied on American capital and expertise to phase out slavery while avoiding the catastrophe that had taken the cotton planters of the American South. To begin with, Brazilians were terrified of US pro-slavery. They knew about the US-Mexican War, they knew about Texas before that, they knew about the filibustering expeditions to Cuba, to Nicaragua, and other parts of Latin America. So an alliance, a pro-slavery alliance between Brazil and the US South was out of question. More importantly, Brazilian slaveholders were not like Anglo-American slaveholders. Instead of fighting to show the world that slavery was superior to free labor and should forever expand, Brazilian planters took a subtler and more effective approach. Even the richest slaveholders of Brazil would admit that slavery was a colonial institution, a legacy of benighted Portuguese patriarchs, which had no viable future. While they admitted that slavery was doomed, Brazilian planters continued to import thousands of slaves from Africa every year, only stopping in 1850 when the British threatened war. After 1850, while they promised to phase out slavery and some even experimented with immigrant sharecroppers on their plantations, Brazilian planters held on to their slaves and kept the system very much alive. Slave labor came to concentrate in the coffee regions of the Southeast, fueling a major coffee boom. This strange balance between anti and pro-slavery occurring in Brazil caught the attention of the people who were attacking the slave system in the American South. Northern missionaries, diplomats, scientists, and entrepreneurs who had the chance to go to Brazil in the 1850s were fascinated with the Brazilian planter class. The Brazilian elite, so the Yankees believed, had accepted the supremacy of free labor and were already taking the path to slave emancipation. The fact that they were going very slow did not bother these Northern observers, not at all. On the contrary, they were happy that Brazil would not go through the experiences of civil war and social unrest that now were a reality in the US. In 1863, Indiana missionary James Cooley Fletcher, who had lived in Brazil in the 1850s, told an audience in Boston that under the action of influences now at work in Brazil, it was generally believed that slavery would come to a final and peaceful end within 20 years. Fletcher's audiences in Boston, New York City, Philadelphia, and DC rejoiced to hear about how the Brazilians were approaching emancipation. During the American Civil War, Brazil, like other Latin American countries and also European powers, took a neutral position. Nonetheless, the Union made a big effort to become closer to Brazil as the war raged. First, Union diplomats sided with Brazil against the British Empire, which was pressuring Brazilian authorities to liberate enslaved Africans who had been brought to Brazil after the slave trade got banned. Simultaneously, Northern contractors built the first railroad connecting Brazil's capital city to the coffee-producing interior. The Dom Pedro II Railroad was designed by a Philadelphia engineer named William Milner Roberts. A Republican and committed anti-slavery reformer, Roberts believed that the railroad would enrich and enlighten the Brazilian planters, helping them transition from slave to free labor. Another entrepreneur was Thomas Rainey of Ohio, who established a ferry line crossing the Guanabara Bay in Rio. Charles Greenough of New York set up the first streetcar line in Brazil, connecting downtown Rio to its growing suburbs, all this in the 1860s and 70s. Many other Yankees had business success in Brazil, but no one matched William Van Vleck Lidgerwood of New Jersey. Arriving in Brazil in 1861, he first started importing agricultural machinery from New Jersey to Brazil. In the early 1870s, he established a factory in the town of Campinas, the heart of the new coffee region of the province of São Paulo. That's the photo you see here. The Lidgerwood coffee hullers were the most important coffee processing devices on Brazilian plantations. Because processing coffee was the most labor-intensive part of production, many planters concluded that the Lidgerwood machines would help them employ wage earners in coffee agriculture. Needless to say, coffee planters took their time and concentrated land and technology in their own hands before really committing to free labor. While Northern entrepreneurs profited from plantation agriculture in Brazil, Brazilians traveled to the United States to see what the wage system could accomplish. Beginning in the early 1870s, dozens of elite Brazilians, including the Emperor Dom Pedro II, visited all regions of the US, from New England to the Pacific coast to the Deep South, always hosted by American capitalists interested in establishing business connections with Brazil. The Brazilians were especially interested in the post-emancipation South. On visiting Louisiana in 1876, Dom Pedro noted that ex-slaves were working, quote, under a year-long contract, which they often renew, making from $13 to $18 per month, depending whether they get food or not. But in both cases, they get housing, which does not seem bad, Dom Pedro concluded. The Brazilian visitors fell in love with industrial capitalism, praising the Northern capitalists for transforming the economy of all American regions by spreading wage labor and concentrating capital. Seeking to learn the formula of American capitalist development, many young Brazilians, the sons of the richest coffee planters, enrolled in the newly established land-grant colleges. Cornell, the University of Cincinnati, the Massachusetts Agricultural College were some of their preferred destinations. When they returned home, these young men built railroads, urban infrastructure, and factories. More important, they refashioned plantation agriculture by applying what they had learned in the United States to Brazil. In addition to the circulation of people, ideas, and technologies, the trade in one specific commodity brought the Brazilian planter class very close to the American North. Seeking to boost morale among its troops, the Union Army imported some 40 million pounds of coffee per year from Brazil during the Civil War. After the war, temperance activists and capitalists found out that coffee was an effective means to increase worker productivity, taking the place of alcoholic beverages. Soon, in factories and construction sites from New York to San Francisco, impoverished and overexploited workers, the proletarian masses of the United States, were drinking gallons of slave-produced coffee from Brazil. Temperance activists, many of whom had anti-slavery backgrounds, trusted that with the money from the coffee trade, Brazilian planters would be able to improve their business and safely transition to free labor. A New York merchant and coffee promoter named Francis Thurber rejoiced that, quote, Brazil has already begun to use new machinery and adopt improved processes of cultivation and preparation upon the plantations. In the 1880s, a popular movement took the Brazilian streets and soon spread to the plantations. Thousands of slaves escaped and found support among the urban population. In 1888, the political elite became convinced that there was no point in resisting the tide of emancipation, and Princess Isabel signed the Golden Law freeing all slaves. The coffee planters were not caught off guard, however. They had money from the coffee trade and technology from the United States to make the transition they had been planning for decades. Drawing on the lessons from the United States, the planters decided to pay for impoverished immigrants from Italy to move to Brazil. They calculated that by expanding the workforce, they would be able to pay low wages to immigrants and ex-slaves on the coffee plantations. Whenever these workers tried to organize or settle on their own, they were brutally repressed. Northerners couldn't be happier with the news of the Golden Law. The Boston Daily Advertiser wrote, a curious fact is that one great means used in Brazil to secure emancipation is the same that President Lincoln proposed without avail to the South. The Republican Party included in their 1888 platform the following statement: we send fraternal congratulations to our fellow Americans of Brazil upon their great act of emancipation, which completed the abolition of slavery throughout the two American continents. In other words, Brazilians had done what the Yankees had planned to do in the United States in the 1850s, but had been prevented by reactionary Southerners. By the early 1890s, Brazil was producing record amounts of coffee with wage labor, most of which continued to be sold to the United States. So to conclude, from the very beginning, powerful Northerners had no intentions of promoting a truly egalitarian process of emancipation. On the contrary, they sought to end slavery to help modernize the plantation system and make planters richer than ever before. Brazilian planters were not as foolish as US Southern planters. Brazilians accepted the gradual emancipation project and the modernizing views of the American North with pleasure. Brazilian planters succeeded in maintaining their power and increasing their profits while slavery crumbled. And they did this by using technology and expertise from the American North. Northern influence helped maintain a rigid class structure in Brazil. It kept ex-slaves down without lands and with civil and political rights on paper only. The capitalists who funded the Republican Party in the United States were happy to see a new order triumph in Brazil. Agro-industrial capitalism and class inequality had been reinvented in the largest country of South America without the conflict and the chaos that had been necessary in the American South. So this is it. I look forward to the conversation with Manisha and your questions.
Thank you, Roberto, for that. Congratulations on the publication of your book. Thank you also, Nan, for that introduction. Though I have to correct you and say that my book was published in 2016 and not 2017. The paperback version came out in 2017, but no worries. Also, thank you, Amanda, for taking care of all the logistics for the program today. So Roberto, I really enjoyed reading your book, and let me begin with a very broad question on, what motivated you to write a book about the transnational reconstruction of capitalism in Brazil and the United States after emancipation. Much of the comparative literature on Brazil and the US had been on the nature of slavery. And I'm thinking of, really old classics like Tannenbaum and Freire and Degler. Much of the new comparative work on emancipation has been done with Cuba rather than Brazil, in the recent work of Rebecca Scott and others. So I want you to sort of broadly talk about what drew you to this topic.
Sure. Thanks, Manisha. So, the main inspiration were the comparative works. At the University of São Paulo, we would read, Degler and Tannenbaum and Freire, and even C. Van Woodward had a comparative short text on, I believe, on the question of slavery and emancipation. My advisor at the University of Pennsylvania has an essay on that as well, Steve Hahn. And unfortunately, that tradition kind of died out. And, I was always interested in comparisons and perhaps going beyond and looking at connections, because this is one thing that everyone knew, everyone mentioned in their works, right? That Brazil, being the second largest slave society in the world, was certainly influenced by what happened in the United States. But no one looked at, the problem before in detail. And I went in to do research thinking that Brazil would be closer to the South, and that the Southerners would be the main influence in Brazil. And it was a very interesting surprise to see that Northerners actually took a very active role in engaging with Brazil, in inviting Brazilians, in going to Brazil, in helping Brazil do what the South did not want to do. So yeah, that's the story.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because it sort of flows in nicely into my next question on the fact that you argue very nicely in your book that Brazilians, including slaveholders, saw Southern pro-slavery imperialism as a threat, right? And they were aware, as you mentioned, of the annexation of Mexican territory, though, of course, in the case of Mexico, Southerners introduced slavery in an area that had abolished slavery. Brazil had not yet done that. And they're also put off by the crude racism of some of these Southerners who come to Brazil. You briefly mentioned that. But, can you elaborate a bit more on why Brazilian slaveholders did not perceive an identity of class interests with Southern slaveholders and vice versa, right? Were the fazendeiros, of course, my Portuguese is abysmal, so you can correct my pronunciation, or the slaveholding coffee planters of Southern Brazil, were, as you cast them, liberal modernizers who had more in common with the Free North. And, were they in fact that were they able to sort of visualize an end to the slavery regime, accept the kind of inevitable? Were they so far-seeing that they were, able to give up literally on slavery and imagine another labor regime that would continue to serve their interests? And why did they invite these unreconstructed Confederates to Brazil with open arms after the Civil War?
All right. Your Portuguese pronunciation is perfect, by the way. Yeah, this is something that I left out of the presentation, but it's a great question, the South. So to begin with your question about why Brazil didn't find a, common cause, a class interest with the South. There are two things, right? First is the filibustering, expansionism, the war on Mexico, the fact that there were people in the US Navy, actually the director of the US Naval Observatory, Matthew Fontaine Maury, a powerful slaveholder and figure in the US Navy, who had plans to take over the Amazon and actually had a public campaign attacking Brazil because Brazil would not open the Amazon for American commerce and settlement in the 1850s. So that's one thing. The other thing is that many diplomats who lived in Brazil before the Civil War were Southerners, and they took, a very obnoxious attitude while in Brazil, writing, racist things, attacking Brazilian politicians, attacking the Brazilian police, creating trouble all the time. So Brazilians were terrified of Southern expansion. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, there's also the question of interest, right? What could the South offer Brazil that Brazil didn't have? Brazilians knew how to, manage slaves, Brazilian elites, Brazilian planters. They knew how to grow cotton if necessary. The South didn't have technology, didn't have infrastructure, didn't have capital to invest in Brazil. And so there's no really interest on the Brazilian part. Brazilians want, industrial technology, and they're going to find it in England, in other parts of Europe, and especially in the United States North. So that's, a choice they're making, a strategic choice. Now, yes, they had that vision. And I think, they share that vision of, a future emancipation. And as I try to emphasize, they're going to take their time. They're going to do it slowly, and they're only going to finalize it when they have the means to employ wage labor profitably on their plantations. And they share that vision with other slaveholding classes and other people who are employing unfree labor in the 19th century. And perhaps Southern slaveholders are an exception to try to insist and to imagine that perhaps, slave labor could triumph, could be, victorious against what you see in England and in the Northern United States. To your other question on the ex-Confederates, I call them ex-Confederates, some people call them Confederados, who go to Brazil immediately after the war and end up becoming sharecroppers dependent on the Brazilian planters. They go with the intention of rebuilding, the South, the slave South in Brazil. But what Brazilian elites, slaveholders, coffee planters want from these Southerners after the Civil War is that they become workers, basically, that they grow cotton that will be manufactured in cotton mills owned by the very coffee planting families. So in a way, they are using ex-Confederate expertise and labor in the same way that they were trying to use. They were experimenting with Swiss immigrants, with German immigrants, with Portuguese, Spanish immigrants as small colonies that will be specialized in one crop and will help the transition, the diversification of the Brazilian economy.
Interesting. So you see the Southern slaveholders as the exception, the sort of reactionaries, right? And one of the major interpretive frameworks that you use in your book is the Theory of Modernization, which was very popular in the 1970s among social scientists, which comes with this understanding of capitalism as a modernizing impulse based on free labor. It fell out of favor with historians because they showed how capitalism could coexist, and in fact, fed off the most, exploitative forms of labor, including modern racial slavery. So how do you view the new history of slavery and capitalism, since your book sort of revives the idea of abolition as really a project of capitalist modernization?
Sure. Yeah. So on the question of modernization, one thing as a historian, I went to the sources, and as I started reading these Northern reformers and these Brazilian liberals, modernizers, it felt like I was reading Marx, that I was reading, old school theory on how capitalism should function, right? So it's an ideology, it's a project. It's not a teleological view of history on my part, is what they are saying that should happen. And again, they are doing it slowly. They're trying to control that process that some will say is inevitable, others will say it's just better, right, to have wage labor instead of slave labor. And that's one thing that I feel is missing in the historiography of slavery and capitalism. We have given historians, and I include myself in my teaching and other things that I've been, doing, too much voice for what pro-slavery ideologues were saying. Their bravado has become, we have accepted their bravado as the reality. So when we read someone like Maury projecting, a hemispheric empire of slavery, it seems that, he has the power to do it, and he fails. Actually, pro-slavery Southerners fail after the US-Mexican War in every enterprise they enter. They fail in Kansas, they fail in other parts of the West, they fail in Cuba, they fail in Nicaragua, right? And they end up being humiliated in the American Civil War. So, yeah, I don't know if I...
No, you did actually, because they succeeded for a long time before they failed, right, in the slaveholding republic. But it's also interesting that you brought up Marx, because Marx is the one who said, "Oh, the union cause is the cause of labor, and the cause of the South is the cause of capital," right? So can you clarify maybe for me your use of terms like anti-slavery reformers and anti-slavery activists to refer to like this whole range of American and Brazilian boosters, entrepreneurs, journalists, diplomats, intellectuals, and students. And sometimes for me as a historian of American abolition, it is a bit of a surprise to read somebody like James Watson Webb, who is, a virulent anti-abolitionist and who sort of incites these anti-abolitionist riots and against Black people, or somebody like Louis Agassiz, who collaborates with Southern pro-slavery ideologues in developing pseudo-scientific theories of race to justify slavery, appear as these anti-slavery reformers and modernizers. And Agassiz is interesting because, he's doing this in the South with those nude photographs of enslaved people, and he does this in Brazil with photographs of indigenous people to justify his theory of polygenesis, or the multiple origins of man, different origins of the races. So I was just wondering if you want to sort of talk about the terms that you're using as, the anti-slavery sort of front in Brazil, many of whom were actually very complicit with slaveholding in the US, and are anti-emancipation until they are represented with presented with a fait accompli. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, the terms are very important. And I avoided the term abolitionist and used the term anti-slavery reformer to clarify that, because yes, there was an abolitionist movement, which has brilliantly been studied by many historians. And there were these people who were opposed to slavery, but were not, fighting for the slaves, the enslaved people, or for democracy, or for equality, or for the proletariat. They were fighting to make a system of labor that would actually bring more profits, more dynamism to those who own capital, right? So these are the anti-slavery reformers. They, however, end up hijacking, in the Brazilian case, the abolitionist movement. There were, some mixing. There were abolitionists who became anti-slavery reformers. There are anti-slavery reformers who radicalized, especially after they saw what happened in the American South or in Brazil. But the anti-slavery reformers are this different group, right? I think about, to make a comparison to what we are living now in a movement that is very important to the world today, think about, environmentalism. Mm-hmm. There are radical sections of the movement, Extinction Rebellion, right? Who are trying to talk about environmental justice and rebuild society in a way that will be sustainable, that will save us, right? The planet and the people who live in this planet. But then there are, corporations using greenwashing and trying to hijack that movement. And if those who care about the future of humanity don't pay attention, perhaps the same could happen to environmentalism that happened to abolitionism. It could be taken by those who are going to manipulate it to create new forms of inequality, new forms of injustice, new forms of destruction.
Yeah, I think that's a very useful distinction, the distinction between sort of this sort of a broader political coalition with anti-slavery moderates and even conservatives, right? Versus, the sort of the social movement, the abolitionists versus the state actors, right? The other term that I want you to talk to us a little bit more about, because it appears in your book a lot, is free labor. And of course, you use it synonymously with wage labor, right, as the sort of defining characteristic of capitalist societies. But of course, in the antebellum North, this had a very broad meaning that could include, small farmers, independent artisans. And the North is predominantly agrarian, like the South on the eve of the Civil War. The industrial sort of takeoff takes place only in the 1870s, much later than Britain, right? And a lot of these old abolitionists end up with labor movements, right? That see wage labor as wage slavery. Somebody like Wendell Phillips or even Garrison, who joins the 8-hour-a-day movement. And a lot of them are fighting these anti-slavery modernizers on emancipation and Reconstruction because they're asking for the redistribution of land, et cetera. And so what one gets in the South after the fall of Reconstruction is really exploitative labor regimes that's in many ways replicate slavery. They're not slavery, but close to slavery. Sharecropping and tenancy devolve into debt peonage. You have convict lease labor that gets around the 13th Amendment's abolition of slavery. There's something similar happen in Brazil's coffee plantations. You talk about the evictions, of freed people. And there, even the sharecroppers, as you mentioned earlier, were European immigrants. So what happens to freed people? Is there another project of emancipation emanating, let's say, from the grassroots, which is very different than this planter-controlled project of modernization that you describe?
Yeah, thanks. That's amazing, very interesting question. Something that I want to keep developing in my research, how free labor becomes synonymous with wage labor. Of course, we have the great work of Eric Foner, Sven Beckert, and others who show that within the Republican Party and the American context. And what I'm trying to show is how the engagement with Brazil, the transition that the Northerners help take place in Brazil is part of that process of identifying, of making free labor synonymous with wage labor and shutting down other possibilities, right? And that's what Brazilian elites, again, Brazilian planters, see in the United States and find very interesting. They don't think sharecropping, for example, is the way to go, because they think, especially the most progressive, the most modernizing anti-slavery reformers from Brazil who come to the United States, they think that will keep an artificial, will keep workers unable to move around, to find better opportunities, not for themselves, but for the economy, right? To have a more natural flow of the workforce to where workers are needed. And they think wage labor, especially as it's emerging in Western agriculture, is actually a better model. These Brazilian planters and their sons who travel to the United States. So your question about what happened and if there was an alternative view in Brazil, yes, there was. There were the Brazilian abolitionist movement is a democratic movement which emerges on the plantations among the slaves, among Afro-Brazilians and other radicals who are always, like in the United States, the most radical groups within the abolitionist movement are coupling emancipation with land reform, land redistribution. And that's how I try to conclude the book, trying to show how that was, shut down, that was excluded, that was violently destroyed, that possibility, because these Brazilians had seen what could happen to them and applied it there in Brazil.
Yeah, I got it. So, one of the big differences between US, Brazilian emancipation is just like chronology, right? So, the gradualist 1871 free boom Rio Branco law comes well after the Civil War and emancipation. The Golden Rule 1888 emancipation law comes well after the complete overthrow of Reconstruction in the United States, the anti-slavery project, right, in the United States. And many of these modernizers that you describe in this book in Brazil, they reminded me a lot of John Sproat's The Best Men, right, in the US, who were contemptuous of abolition and Reconstruction. They were classical, laissez-faire liberals. They didn't want the state to intervene in the economy. They were breakaway liberal Republicans who you refer to who joined with racist Democrats to overthrow Reconstruction and helped convert the Republican Party from the party of sort of anti-slavery into big business. It's like transformation that takes place in the sort of major aims of the Republican Party. So these Brazilian modernizers and reformers of the 1870s and 1880s seem to me very allied with these men who actually repudiate both abolition and Reconstruction and point the way to the Gilded Age, right? They're sort of economic boosters. They're very enthusiastic about railroads and technological change, as you write about them very, very nicely. They seem to be more a part of that transition of the Republican Party rather than a sort of clean alliance between the sort of earlier the party of Lincoln and the Liberal Party in Brazil.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. That's there's a character I write about, José Carlos Rodrigues, the editor of O Novo Mundo, who he came to the United States and he was pretty fascinated with the Republicans in general, but he quickly realized, who he, really aligned with, and he becomes a critic of Reconstruction and of Grant, and with the idea of he supports the idea of leaving the South alone, right? Ending occupation, ending intervention. And the thing with laissez-faire and minimum government, right, is clearly, like today, they don't like the government. They don't like intervention when it's against their interests, when it's, financing, distributing favors to railroads, or financing the Brazilian project of bringing immigrants, or crushing unions, crushing working class movements. Then the government is great, right? Like with perhaps any human being, any social movement we study, there's a lot of fluctuation. There's a lot of people changing their minds. But as the years go by, the Republicans and these Brazilian liberals, modernizers, some of them Republicans in Brazil as well, become more and more conservative when it comes to economic policy and to the role of the government.
Yeah, you make an excellent point. They're always very interested in using the sort of repressive powers of the state, right? But not the idea of a social state is what is objectionable. But yeah, and slaveholders did that too, right? If you think of the fugitive slave law and some of these other laws. I can see that Nan has come up, and we should open up our floor to discussion here. But briefly, last question, which is, how is your description of Brazilian abolitionists so differ from recent work on Brazilian abolition by Celso Thomas Castillo, who blurbed your book, or Isadora Mota and Samantha Payne, who seem to be pushing for sort of different view of abolition in Brazil, despite the fact that many of the sort of emancipatory legacies were completely overthrown both in the US and Brazil. Yeah.
Well, we mentioned great friends and great influences in my work. And what I'm trying to do is to add this new dimension, add, these people who hijacked the movement, try to show that, yes, abolitionism was a democratic movement that tried to change things, but there was this other faction that had power, that had capital, and that had the support of, the country, that the United States, that was growing the fastest and was setting out to modernize the world. So I think it's more of adding something than challenging other interpretations when it comes to abolitionism.
Great. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm going to let Nan moderate this.
Well, great. Thanks for this great discussion. I hate to interrupt, but we have some great questions coming in from the audience. And let me just quickly say, Manisha, yes, I apologize for getting the date on your book, and I know exactly what happened because of all those awards that you won. I had realized the introduction was too long, so I cut it out, and that was the Frederick Douglass Prize and the many other prizes in 2017. So apologies for that, but certainly many prizes in 2016 too when it came out. Well, we have some really fantastic questions, so I want to get started and get through as many of these as possible, and you can both engage here as needed. So Chris Clark asked a couple questions. One, what role did racial ideology play in the attitudes of Brazilian planters to slavery and its future? And two, if hypothetically the US had not abolished slavery in the 1860s, would Brazilian slavery have ended anyway in the 1880s?
Right, so thank you, Chris. Chris was an important part. He participated in the symposium we had at the AES for my manuscript. And these are great questions. Question number two, I'll be honest, I don't know. I love counterfactuals. I have fun with them with my students, but looking at what was happening to other countries in Latin America, how the British were acting, I don't think slavery could have survived too much longer than the 1880s. But again, this is a counterfactual, this is speculation. But I don't see, Brazil perpetuating it under English pressure. Actually, perhaps the Northern influence helped Brazilians do it in a certain way that they wouldn't do, or the British acting alone without, the Northerners counterbalancing their pressure. Now, the first question, this is something that there's so much to be written on Brazilian racial attitudes and how they connect to things that Manisha, for example, was mentioning, Louis Agassiz and scientific racism in the United States, that I don't go very deep into this question in my book. But this was very important. One thing that I've been thinking about recently, and perhaps this is a topic for an article, is how Brazilians saw the problem of the color line and racial terror by white supremacists in the South against African Americans, and how Brazilians, seeing that, responded with a different form of racism, one that planned to whiten the Brazilian population by bringing immigrants instead of scaring away workers, creating upheaval, creating chaos because of racial violence. But I need to look more into this question. Thanks, Chris.
Great, thank you. We have a question here from Richard Thayer, and he put two versions of this. I'm going to read the one from the chat, which he tried to move over, but I think it's a little more complete in the chat version, which is, who were the people in Sao Paulo who encouraged Confederados from the American South to migrate to the Campinas? And wasn't it true that these Southerners found the climate, land, and availability of slaves to be the attraction of Sao Paulo and Campinas in particular?
Yeah. So the families were the Vergueiros, the Paula Sousas, the major slaveholders and coffee planters of Brazil. Campos Salles, all the anti-slavery reformers I'm thinking about, I'm writing about. They were inviting these Southerners, and the Southerners came with this idea that they would go and they would actually teach Brazil how to do things, how to manage slaves, how to build plantations, how to be a slave power, right? And when they get there, slaves are too expensive. Good land is expensive. And they encounter these Brazilian elites with a very clear plan on how to employ them, how to put them to work in lands that are not good for coffee, but good for cotton, and to have them stay on a dependent position. Some of them try to acquire slaves, some do, right? They rent slaves, but at the end of the day, they cannot compete. Cotton, I write in the book, is the poor man's crop in Brazil. Coffee is the thing. And you have many of these ex-Confederates writing about this, saying, if I could, I would grow coffee, but I can't. So I'm just a poor man here in Brazil. And that was engineered. That was designed by these Brazilian elite coffee planters.
Yeah, okay, great, thank you. So Rosalind Dergelwitz is saying, fascinating thesis. It reminds me of the 1790s in the US when planters believed slavery would die out and that they would need to diversify. But in that case, technology such as cotton gin drove the increasing need for slave labor and monoculture. Have you considered the parallel and what it might teach us about what could have happened in the US?
Yeah, that's a great parallel, right? Even people like Jefferson thought that slavery would eventually spread and die out. And that's exactly what didn't happen, especially after the Louisiana Purchase. But that's a great parallel, and I think kind of reinforces the idea that pro-slavery in the middle of the 19th century in the US is an exception to a rule of the long 19th century in which most of these planter elites who were employing forms of unfree labor were thinking about ways to phase out, to transition, to find other ways, especially because, they looked at Haiti and saw what slavery created there. They were scared, the idea of an internal enemy, of slave rebellion all over the Americas was something that was always present. And I think most importantly, they looked at England. They looked at the northern United States and they saw that they were, losing. They were losing the economic competition against these industrialized parts of the world based on wage labor.
Great, thank you. And here's another member of one of your colloquium committee members, Barbara Weinstein, is asking, would you situate your book vis-a-vis the historiography of the second slavery and the question of slavery and modernity? And Manisha might want to weigh in on this too, I don't know, and I'll let you go ahead, Roberto.
Sure, Manisha, if you want to go first, that would be great, but.
I can give you a break. Hello, Barbara. Barbara Weinstein was my teacher too. So we share that, Roberto, you and I. The idea of second slavery is something that I think really changed the ways in which we understand the rise of modern capitalism. It's second slavery, it's second serfdom in Eastern Europe, and also the institution of really forms of labor that we would see as unfree throughout the global South with the spread of Western imperialism. And that's why I was questioning you a little bit, Roberto, about the sort of modernization idea based on wage labor, because it seemed capitalism in the 19th century with the second slavery in Brazil, not the sugar planters of the Northeast, but the coffee planters of the South. And in the South, not the early tobacco planters, but the cotton kingdom. These were global events. And it seems to go with, exploitation of labor, long-term, term contracts, coolie labor from India, China. They're all experimenting, it seems to me, in all kinds of unfree labor rather than free labor. And that was sort of my question to you. And Barbara's framed it particularly in the context of the second slavery of Cuba, Brazil, and the United States. But I would see it as a global phenomenon that would include the second serfdom in Eastern Europe and the institution of various forms of unfree labor in the global South by Western imperialism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Barbara, for the question. This is a very important one. And as Manisha said, there's an expansion, right? A huge increase of unfree forms of labor in the 19th century that go along with the emergence of industrial capitalism, but then they collapse. And no one even noticed. There's no sugar shortage after emancipation in Cuba. There's no cotton shortage, at least not in the long term. After the Civil War, there's no coffee for sure shortage after the end of slavery in Brazil. And so I think that's important to point out when we talk about second slavery, because if slavery was so central as historians have been claiming, then something would have happened, right? That capitalism would have entered a crisis, and it didn't, because people were employing unfree labor as much as they could, as long as they could, realize that there were other ways, actually more effective, more profitable ways to employ workers. And there were steps they had to take, for example, enclosing land, destroying alternative ways of life, self-sufficiency, etc., building railroads, accumulating capital, but it could be done. So there is this expansion, but then it declines. And certain groups were able to manage that transition, were able to see it coming, and some didn't. And that's what I'm trying to show when I compare the Brazilian slaveholders to US South slaveholders. So that's the intervention I'm trying to make with the question of second slavery, slavery and capitalism, and these things that have been coming out recently.
There's a question here from Thomas Angel, who's he's curious about what President Lincoln's policy on Brazil was and whether he supported Brazilian emancipation.
So Lincoln, I'm not sure about Lincoln, exactly, but I know that Seward sent James Watson Webb, who was very close to him personally, and Webb from Connecticut, a general in the US Army, who fought in the US-Mexican War and thought that he should be, general of the Union Army, commander of the Union Army during the Civil War, and no one could stand the guy, but it's an important guy. They sent him to Brazil, and they sent him with clear instructions to remove any Southern, any possibility of Southern influence in Brazil, and also to challenge British influence in Brazil, which he actually does. So you have this Republican, right? This Union commander going to Brazil during the Civil War and defending Brazilian slaveholding interests against British anti-slavery imperialism, right? So it gets complicated. As Manisha said, this guy had been an anti-abolitionist before, but now he's working with these modernizers in the United States and in Brazil and the Republican Party, very close to Seward, to make sure that Brazil would side or stay neutral, but would be more friendly to the North. About Lincoln, I know, Lincoln was a colonizationist. He wanted to send free people out of the United States. And there were conversations of sending, there were, discussions and speculations of sending them to places in Latin America. So that might be a connection that could be looked at.
And I would just add a little bit to that. Lincoln really evolves in his views. He goes from colonization to abolition, and then he becomes the first American president to endorse Black citizenship publicly, right, including the right to vote. So I think he evolves in that, but I do think, Seward, of course, becomes more conservative. He evolves the other way and becomes a big acolyte of Andrew Johnson by the end of his career. But I would also argue that Lincoln had a sense that emancipation was a global phenomenon. He doesn't say anything specific about Brazil, Cuba, or Puerto Rico, all had slavery. But he does say that emancipation is the sort of central act of his administration, but also the great event of the 19th century. So he has the sense that it has a kind of a global implication. And people use this, they throughout the world, throughout the global South. You show this in your book too, Roberto, how they celebrate Lincoln in Brazil, which I thought was fascinating, that they would reproduce that iconography of Washington welcoming the martyred Lincoln, right? So that he has this kind of global sort of resonance, besides the exact policies that Webb and Seward are promoting in Brazil at that point, right?
Yeah, and people like the railroader I mentioned, William Milner Roberts, he embraces this idea of anti-slavery as a mission, as a modernizing mission that's gonna, be profitable for him, but as something that the last best hope of humanity, right? So they manipulate that idea to invest in Brazil, basically.
Well, we are out of time, and there are still questions left. So I'm kind of torn here, but I think given that it's after 8 already, we should stop. But I'm wondering if Roberto, we'll see if we can get some of these questions to you if you're willing to address. There's a few good ones. A lot of people are saying this is a great talk, so they really there's some very great responses here. But thank you so very much. This has been really a terrific conversation, great presentation, of course, a great book. So I really appreciate both of you, your time and your expertise tonight. This has been really fun. And thank you to our audience. This has been really great questions, and we're delighted that you joined us. And let me just say very quickly that you should join us, take a look at our website and upcoming programs. Our next public program is on Thursday, March 22nd, when Nancy Rubin Stewart will talk about her new book, Poor Richard's Women, in conversation with AAS President Scott Casper. And on the 31st, we have a book talk at 2 p.m. with Hannah Farber on her book, Underwriters of the United States, How Insurance Shaped the American Founding. And if we look ahead to early April, there are two really terrific talks in the first week of April. One by Theoria Glimpf on April 5th on her book, The Women's Fight. And on April 7th, Taya Miles will be presenting on her book, All That She Carried. So lots to look ahead to. And in May, we look forward to starting hybrid programming. On May 17th, we'll have Robert Gross here in Annie Crane Hall, but you'll also be able to join virtually. So lots to look forward to. Go to our website to find out and register for those programs. And thank you again for joining us, all of you out there, and to Roberto and Manisha. Have a good evening.
Thanks.